So here are some sketches from my sketchbooks. I usually draw scenes from my daily life, so you'll see drawings of my kids, my friends, and what's around me in the food center. When I went to Japan, I captured the sights around me with pen and watercolor. I draw these sketches there and then on location, between 5 to 15 minutes, and sometimes if I want to take my time, maybe 20 minutes. Sometimes it is essential that I draw fast or my food will get cold. Maybe that's not such a big problem for sashimi, but I still want to get to my food quick when I'm hungry. So would you like to learn how to draw anything, whether it's people or places, very simply and quickly? Okay, let me show you how I do it. First, this is how I used to draw everything. I'll draw each and every object separately. I'll use construction lines to help me determine the form of each object, then ink it. For me, I found it to be a slower process, especially when it comes to outdoor sketching, because it requires a lot more logic, greater knowledge of 3D forms, and it actually feels like work. Now, this form of sketching is totally valid, but I now prefer to use this method of drawing. I found the contour drawing method to be faster, uses almost no logic at all, and is a lot more relaxing. And I don't need to know how to draw anything except shapes. So this is a colored shape. To be good at contour drawing, all you need to do is practice outlining or contouring shapes as accurately as possible. When outlining shapes, it's good to get the angles right, best you can. If it helps, try to imagine your line like a clock hand pointing at a certain hour of the day. I also pay attention to where one bump appears in relation to another bump. And I gauge the length of one part by looking at the length of another part. I pay attention to every slight tilt that the shape has, so my eyes have to be glued onto the shape as I draw, constantly. And if you make a mistake, don't sweat it, just continue drawing. Learn to leave the mistakes there. It can look more authentic. So this is how I would draw the same scene now. I see everything as shapes, and I first tackle the big shapes. The first big shape would be the frame. Now you don't always have to draw the frame, but starting out I think it's a good practice because it helps define the borders of the scene. Next, I try to cut up that first big shape into 2 or 3 more big shapes. Notice that this shape is similar to the practice shape, it's just different bumps. When I'm drawing in the contour method, I'm always reminding myself to not see people as people, and I don't even see objects as objects. I just see people and objects as all the same. They are all shapes, all just colored shapes. But I know most of you will tell me that that's really hard to do because when I see a head, I just see a head, and when I see a person, I see a person. It seems that our brains are always trying to identify things so we can make sense of things logically. And that's why I have grouped the people in this scene together with the objects to form this second big shape. This makes it difficult for my brain to identify each object as what it is. So my brain just switches from logic mode to visual mode and just identifies this whole shape as just a shape. And if you can draw shapes, you can draw it. Got it? Okay, so just finishing this second shape. Now, how do you find the third and fourth big shape? Simply look at the first 2 shapes and try to cut them up into big chunks, not small chunks. Just find a separation between multiple objects and separate the shape there. And here's another big chunk. This first stage is the most important. If the big shapes are drawn accurately, it's a lot more easy for the small shapes to fall into place. As you can see, I'm still combining multiple objects to form my small shapes, so my brain does not identify them as the objects. It just continues seeing them as shapes. So I'm still cutting up the big shapes into smaller shapes, but I'm still going for the biggest chunks I can find. The plan is to move from the biggest chunks to the smaller chunks until we reach the tiniest chunks. As a rule of thumb, go from big to small. Now as for small, inconsequential background details, I often treat them like they are out of focus. So I usually just draw them as small floating shapes. But I make sure that they are positioned as accurately as possible in relation to the other shapes. In order to do this, my eyes have to be continually glued to the scene. If I'm looking at my paper and drawing in the details, I usually end up drawing it inaccurately, or I draw shapes in wrong places. I do take quick glances at my paper, but then my eyes always go back to looking at the scene. And lastly, I like filling in the blacks because the blacks will just stay as blacks even after I color. And that's pretty much how I outline a scene. So to recap, I do the big shapes first, then the small shapes, and then the tiny details. If you're just starting out, I recommend just capturing the first 3 or 4 big shapes of a scene and just stopping there. Because if you can capture big shapes accurately, the rest of the smaller shapes will just fall into place. This method of drawing is easy, but like all things, it'll take practice to be good at it. Try it out and see how it works for you. Thanks for watching.